Welcome to TWD Symbolism Analysis, hosted by me at TWD Music Box Mystery, also known as author Lisa K. Hill. This is where we totally geek out about the recurring symbols we see in the show, what they mean, how they connect, and what they foreshadow. So if you're a TWD geek, come over to the dark side. We have Daryl. Good morning, Walker enthusiasts. So today I'm going to talk about the deer symbolism. And I've said before, I'm actually particularly proud of the deer symbolism, mostly because I'm pretty sure I was the first one in Team Delusional to come up with it. And so that was a point of pride for me because nobody else had really talked about it quite in this way before. Don't get me wrong, people had looked at the deer as a symbol, but it usually had to do more with Carl because of the deer he was staring at when he got shot in season 2, but people hadn't linked it to Beth in a huge way. So let me tell you what happened. I was watching episode 510, Them, which is obviously a very important episode for TD and especially for me and my TD journey. And there's a kind of a long scene-ish where Daryl goes off on his own. He's very depressed in that episode. He's grieving Beth very heavily, and he keeps leaving the group and going off on his own, supposedly to look for water, which is extremely symbolic, but they really literally had no water at that point as well. And he sees this deer. It's dead. It's a deer carcass. And it's obviously been there for a while, not something he could pick up and give the group to eat or anything. It's quite rotted and nasty. And there's also the corpse of a man sitting against a tree there, and it looks like this man committed suicide, like he shot himself in the head. You could interpret the symbolism a lot of ways. Daryl was, borderline suicidal in this episode. But I remember rewinding that scene over and over again and staring at it and just going, what is up with the scene? Why do they have this in here? Because The Walking Dead's a very popular show, and they only have so much screen time to deal with. Kind of a little side ramble, but you get a lot of people, a lot of fans who, give the show flack about how we never see them find new supplies. We never see Daryl make new arrows. How come he has this endless supply of arrows? And it's just understood that that stuff happens off screen. If this was a show where it was 45 minutes of them whittling new arrows, that would be extremely boring and nobody would like it. So it's just people finding ridiculous things to complain about. But, we come back to this. Why would they have this scene of him staring at a dead deer? You always have to ask, what is the importance of the scene? What does it do to move the plot forward? Why do they have this scene in the show? And this is one of those scenes that there really wasn't a reason for it. I mean, yes, it showed that he was sad. Yes, it was obviously thematic with the corpse there and everything, but they showed him being sad throughout that whole episode. It was really obvious. They even had the scene by the barn where he was self-harming. You didn't really need the deer scene to establish that Daryl's sad right now, okay? It was extremely obvious. It was prevalent through the whole episode. So I was looking at this scene and trying to figure out why they put the scene in with the deer. And the answer, of course, is that it's highly symbolic, but that, you guys know me. I'm all about the symbolism, so that led me to symbolic of what? I think I didn't know for a long time. And then I kind of came across something about Carl's deer and how the deer died, but Carl, lived, even though this was in season 2 when he was shot and taken to Herschel. And he probably should have died from a wound like that. We're talking about a little kid that got shot in the chest with, I think it was a shotgun, wasn't it? Or buckshot. And especially when they had no hospitals and Herschel wasn't even actually a people doctor. He was an animal doctor. And, the odds of Carl surviving that were very small, but he did. And so there was just, the post I was reading was making some correlation between Carl surviving and the deer dying. And that really, really struck a chord with me because I was trying to think of other times in the show when we've seen deer, because the best way to try to figure out what a symbol means is to look at how the writers have used it previously in the show. Well, I thought about Carl being shot and the deer he was looking at in season 2. And the next one that occurred to me was Lizzie and Mika in season 4. In the episode The Grove, there was a deer, and Carol kept trying to get Mika to shoot the deer because she was trying to teach her how to survive. And Mika was just too sweet and didn't want to kill the deer. I remembered that at the end, after Lizzie and Mika died, Carol looks up and sees this deer standing there. And I went, so that was kind of similar to the Carl thing, only the opposite. I mean, in this case, Lizzie and Mika did die, but the deer lived. And so it just kind of set me on fire thinking about this, that it's a thing where when the deer lives, the person dies. And when the person lives, the deer dies. So in season 2, the deer definitely died. It got shot and it died, but Carl lived. So you could almost have seen that as confirmation that no matter how bad it was, Carl was going to live through that. Whereas because the deer didn't die in 414 The Grove, that, might have been a foreshadow that Lizzie and Mika were going to die instead. So that got me super excited because then I looked at this, scene from Them, 510, and I went, hey, that's confirmation that Beth is alive. I will say that there's been a few deer scenes that were a little bit confusing for us. Things that we're not exactly sure how they fit into this theory, but we have an idea, and the best way for us to figure it out is just to keep watching and see how it evolves. So there was a scene where Michonne shot a deer in let's see, season 7. I want to say it was 704. And she brought it back to Alexandria, and that's when Negan showed up to take all their guns, and he took the deer with him. Now, Michonne shot the deer died, so obviously Michonne lived, and she was never really in a whole lot of danger. Usually there has to be something dangerous that they survived that maybe they by all odds shouldn't have. So that's why we're a little bit confused about that. We're not sure exactly who was in danger of dying in that the deer died instead. But it might point to a death fake out, and especially this season as Michonne's leaving, I'm thinking we don't entirely understand what that was pointing to yet, but it was probably a foreshadow of her coming arc where she's going to leave to go find Rick. So again, I'm not 100% sure on that, but I'm thinking that it's something we just don't entirely understand yet. Another confirmation we got of this deer theory being correct comes from 712, which was where Michonne and Rick were on the road together looking for supplies, and they ended up at the defunct carnival, right? Okay, there was a major foreshadow of Rick's death fake out in that episode. He fell off of one of the rides he had climbed up, and he was looking at the deer, and he fell off, and Michonne thought for a minute that the walkers had gotten him and he was dead. He actually did escape. Now, this is a major parallel to things we saw with Beth. So there was a walker horde involved, for one thing. He escaped through a kind of a dark tunnel. We didn't see the inside of the tunnel, but he went through the ride and came out a yellow door. I have not done color schemes yet, but yellow usually represents escape, which is why it's interesting that Beth was wearing her yellow polo when she was shot. And then he reunited with Michonne. Everything was okay. Then at the end of that episode, we see the two of them talking in the car about what would happen if either of them died and how the other one needs to carry on with leadership. And I remember me and my fellow theorists talking about that, and we were trying to figure that out because that is a really obvious death foreshadow that one of them is going to die. But understand, this was when season 7 was on. We did not actually know yet that Rick was leaving the show, that Andy was going to leave. That did not come out until between seasons 8 and 9, I think, is when that news broke, that he would be leaving during season 9. So we had no idea that he was leaving, and we're going, they're really not going to kill Rick. We really don't see them killing off Michonne. So we don't know what this is pointing to, but this is a really obvious death omen. They wouldn't be talking about this if it wasn't going to happen at some point. And then the next season, middle of season 8, when Carl died, we wondered if it was pointing toward Carl, even though they were talking about themselves and not Carl. We kind of wondered if maybe it was still aimed toward that because losing him was still losing a member of their nuclear family. Anyway, and it wasn't until after that we found out Rick was leaving, but that was a huge death foreshadow of Rick. You know, obviously he didn't die. We, the audience, know he didn't die, but Michonne thinks he's dead. So that was a foreshadow of that. Okay, so that was a little bit of a tangent, but back to the deer. We saw the deer, and I remember when I saw it, I went, okay, there's a deer. We got to pay attention to this deer. And if the deer had lived through the episode, that would have actually been a really bad thing for Rick because it would have meant that Rick was going to die during his ordeal. Thankfully, Rick kind of pulled a Glenn. He got out from under the walker horde and scooted not under a dumpster, but into the ride and escaped that way, same as Glenn kind of did in season 6, and the deer died. Hence, the deer died, the person lived. And it often has to do with that death fake outs. Obviously, that wasn't the case with Lizzie and Mika, but often we see this around death fake outs. The only other instance of the deer that we're a little bit unsure about is that we're pretty sure when Carl was bitten, there was a dead deer underneath him. We don't ever actually see the animal's head or face, but there are like hooves that look like some sort of deer. He kind of fell against the carcass of the deer, and that's when he was bitten. And we're not exactly sure what to do with that because the deer was obviously dead. It was a deer carcass, unless it was some other animal that just looked a lot like a deer. I mean, like I said, we never saw its face, but we're pretty sure that's what it was. And Carl obviously did die, but you know, you also had the deer when he was shot the first time, and I just wonder if it was kind of a strange callback. Again, it doesn't exactly fit the deer symbolism, so we're not exactly sure what to do with that, but it also doesn't nullify the deer theory because it's been true every single other time. So we're not exactly sure what to make of the deer when Carl was bitten, but there was also a phoenix that showed up when he was bitten. So it's one of those things, once again, I think it will make more sense as the story progresses, and something about his death, I believe, will lead to Beth. It will be a very long cause and effect chain. Obviously, him dying didn't bring her back the next episode or anything like that, but him dying did save Negan's life, and it's had interesting repercussions on the rest of the show. So we're kind of reserving judgment on that until we get a little bit further in the story and see what happens. But this is the crux of the deer theory. theory. When the deer lives, the person dies, and therefore, because Daryl was staring at this dead deer in 510, which is also when the music box woke up, that's a big sign that she actually lived through her ordeal. And if the deer lives, as with Lizzie and Mika, then the person dies. So when I get all excited and start pointing at deer symbolism, this is why, because it's important and we've seen it multiple times throughout the show. Actually, one that I didn't include that people have pointed out is that in the first episode Daryl was in, 103, the first time we saw him, he was hunting a deer. And by the time he got to it near the camp, walkers, he had wounded it with his arrows and it collapsed, but walkers got to it, so they didn't get to eat it. And at that point, Merle had disappeared, even though Daryl didn't know it yet. So people have pointed out that maybe the dead deer then represented Merle living, even though he cut off his hand and everything. So that might have been a really early instance of the deer symbolism. So they've used it for a long time throughout the show, and it's super important. So yeah, keep an eye out for that as we keep watching episodes. Have fun.